Warning: this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Gandhi was a racist who forced young girls to sleep in bed with him. What facts about history will never be taught in school? It took me an anthropology class in college to learn about human zoos. That is, zoos where white people paid money to see Aboriginal people from various regions in cages. It happened all over the world, including in the Bronx Zoo in the 1920s. I had never heard about anything like that in any schooling before that, and I doubt most people have. It's kinda like how Chinese companies like to hire white actors to pretend to work for or with a company to somehow bring prestige to the brand. They are known as white monkey gigs. Surprised no one brought it up, but yeah, the Crystal Palace of London was host to the Grand Expo, which exhibited such human zoos, having Aboriginal people of all locations set up in an exhibit to attempt to demonstrate their living habits and conditions. Really messed up. And definitely a subject usually skimmed over in most schools until you get to degree-level studies. Human zoos were active until about 1958, in fact. Many people reading this will either have a grandparent or parent who was alive during the existence of these, which really puts it into perspective. Most of the world was really into butt sex, until the Abrahamic religions took over. Male-on-male relationships were popular and common, to a degree, in Roman and Greek culture. When Christianity became the dominant religion with the rise of Constantine, things such as sodomy and male-to-male relationships begin to dwindle until eventually being outlawed altogether. Around the world there are examples of same-sex relations being a practice carried out to varying degrees based on the culture. With the arrival of Europeans to these places, those practices were usually stamped out in brutal fashion. That the Middle Eastern countries were more involved in the African slave trade, and it continues to this day to some extent. Also that the USA was not even close to a quarter of the slave trade. But it is the most publicized slavery tale. Also, poor white people were slaves from 250 BC, documented, until the early 1700s. They were slaves to kingdoms. They were tortured and left tied to trees in the forest, if not outright killed or lynched. In American Civil War history, the Union, especially Abraham Lincoln, are often portrayed as kindly, benevolent liberators freeing slaves from the evil South. In reality, the average person in the Union was very racist by modern standards. There were also quite a few Southern sympathizers living in the Union. It's much simpler and prettier to teach it as this: black and white, everyone on this side of the line is immoral and everyone on this side is good. Lots of historical figures were gay. The person that most of us know as gay was Sappho, who wrote many poems about her love for women. In fact, Sappho lived on the island of Lesbos, which is why we call homosexual women lesbians today. But there are also people that you didn't expect, like Leonardo da Vinci, who was accused of sodomy with a male prostitute among some other stuff. One of my personal favorite gay historical figures were Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. No, I'm not about to spout things from the Hamilton musical. The two wrote letters with some very spicy language in which Hamilton proclaims his love for John on numerous occasions. Some parts of these letters were so spicy that future biographers, such as one of Hamilton's sons, cut and crossed out certain parts. How bad the rape of Nanking was. I read up on that a while ago and it left me feeling shocked at just how evil humans can be to other humans. It's possibly one of the worst atrocities mankind has ever committed. The Japanese mass murders of their Asian subjects was worse than the Nazi Holocaust. There are literally Japanese still alive that were involved directly or indirectly. It was actually so bad the Nazis offered to step in and negotiate peace. A little-known fact was that before Germany allied with Japan, they were allies of China. Until 1936, Germany was regularly sending arms and officers to China to train and equip the Kuomintang. Chinese forces armed and trained by the Germans became some of the fiercest resistors to the Japanese invasion. Hitler even spoke positively about the Chinese, commenting on their long history of dynastic civilization, though Germany ultimately stayed neutral in China's war with Japan, later becoming allies with Japan largely in opposition of their common enemies, the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and then the United States when they entered the war. The My Lai massacre in Vietnam. An entire battalion of U.S. Marines marched into a village and killed over 600 people indiscriminately. Men, women, and children. Most of the women were raped before they were killed. Babies were shot, families were lined up against walls and gunned down. The only reason it stopped was because a Black Hawk pilot flew down between a group of soldiers and a large Vietnamese family. He got reinforcements and reported everything that happened. One of the biggest embarrassments in U.S. military history. How much in common we have with people of the past. Pictures, sculptures and carvings going all the way back showing drugs, drinking, partying and graffiti that you would see on an abandoned building or train today. The plight of the middle class and class struggles versus the upper class is the same today as for thousands of years. If we could listen to a court jester, their jokes would ring true today more than likely. Outside of technology making things faster or easier in a sense, we're still doing, enjoying or complaining about most of the same things we have been for millennia. Those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, and there's nothing new under the sun is real. The Tulsa Race Massacre. In the early 1920s, Tulsa, Oklahoma had a very affluent black neighborhood called Black Wall Street. Basically, many African Americans were doing better financially than whites. White folks were angry about their success and wanted their land. An African American was wrongly accused of assault by a white girl, and the whites used this as an excuse to attack the neighborhood, including dropping bombs from World War I-era planes. Many were killed and beaten. Over 10,000 people were left homeless due to houses and businesses being burned down. This is the greatest single incident of racial violence in U.S. history. That Argentina pretty much eliminated the black race. They had ways to get rid of the men first. Not as much for the women though. Once the male-to-female ratio drastically dropped, black population, the women were pretty much forced to sleep with white men, in order to wash out the black. The black population was so low, the Argentine government pretty much removed the black option as a race. Crazy how they succeed. I'm Argentinian and I was never formally taught that in school, but it was always mentioned. If the facts I got were right, it's really not that crazy that they succeeded. Slavery wasn't as prominent as it was in other areas, not saying there weren't any slaves, just that there weren't as many, and they simply put them in the front lines, gave them the riskiest of missions in all wars. Absolutely horrible. There isn't such a strong anti-black sentiment now, thankfully. If anything, racism is worse towards natives and immigrants, and classism is the strongest form of discrimination by far. That you need to remove the whole good guys and bad guys mentality and actually learn to accept different moral standards of the past. For example, in UK schools, when the empire is covered, it's from a perspective of how bad and evil it was, yet when it comes to Romans/Saxons/Vikings etc., it's more about what happened and the consequences without any direct judgment given. The Romans are covered for their historical impact to the British Isles, not condemned for their brutal suppression of the natives. Vice versa, in World War II it's all about how great the Allies were in defeating the Axis. They would never cover stuff such as the Dresden bombings. I have a Facebook acquaintance who tried to shame America for the attacks on Hiroshima. His post was gaining traction until I less than politely ran down the timeline of events leading to the bombings. Rape of Nanking, Korean pleasure girls, couple of other notable events leading to America's involvement, all with corresponding dates and wiki articles. It's funny watching someone go from smug know-it-all to backtracking, so they're not completely wrong about everything. And the icing on the cake was his response of, if you can't be polite about having an intelligent statement, you shouldn't say anything at all. About the lost children of Francoism. These children were abducted from Republican parents who were either in jail or had been assassinated by nationalist troops during the Spanish Civil War in Francoist Spain. These children were then given to families that would practice Catholicism and nationalism. However, this lasted after 1975, when Franco died. By then this practice was already a trafficking business run by nuns, doctors and nurses. My mom is a lost children and she has told me that almost anyone has found their parents. Same thing happened in Argentina during the Argentine Dirty War. Leftist women had their children snatched and given to loyalists of the junta, while the women were usually killed or disappeared. Hitler gave his soldiers meth because it was performance enhancing. Not the same meth as we know it today, they were given ephedrazine. The same stuff that the US military was giving to its pilots and special forces groups, same stuff you could buy at gas stations and GNC for alertness and weight loss up until its ban in 2004. Guess what? They still give military people drugs like that, modafinil and a few others. The Japanese military kidnapped hundreds, if not thousands, of Korean and Chinese women during World War II and forced them to be sex workers for the Japanese military. Some Japanese women were even drafted to be comfort women, but they didn't know what they were being drafted for until they were there. It's actually a pretty common thing in many wars, because the military wants to keep the soldiers pure. By kidnapping these women, they know that they aren't riddled with STDs. It's very sad, especially because when the war is over, many of the camps are cleared and these women are forced to find their way back home, without even knowing the war is over. If they aren't too afraid or ashamed to go back home, they're usually turned away from their families because they are so ashamed of what happened. Gandhi was a racist who forced young girls to sleep in bed with him. He was a sex-crazed creep who slept naked with other men's wives in order to test his abstinence. He also slept naked with his teenage grandniece to test himself. Similar thing with Mother Teresa. She is known for being this pure, spiritual, and good person. However, she thought suffering brought people closer to God, so she denied patients painkillers in her hospitals. She also believed in prayer more than medicine, so the treatment wasn't as good as in normal hospitals. Result, her hospitals had more suffering and a really high death rate. My Chinese tour guides who were in their mid-20s did not know about the Tiananmen Square massacre and Tank Man. They looked at us time we had 3 heads when we asked about us during our visit. The corrupt Chinese government goes great lengths to censor any mention about 4th June on the internet, and it is not taught in school. I've read an article that said that before the anniversary lots of Chinese websites go offline as to not trigger the firewall that blocks any mention about it. The words that could trigger the firewall could be obviously Tiananmen, but also, that year, or May 35. That the Atlantic slave trade was fed by fierce African tribes enslaving and then trading off less fierce African tribes to the ships that took them to the colonies. Europeans kept dying of disease when trying to penetrate too far inland in Africa. Coastal Africans would capture slaves, or acquire them by trade themselves, and then trade them to the Europeans for manufactured goods, and cowrie shells, I guess. Europeans encouraged wars between groups in Africa, as war would lead to more prisoners of war to be sold as slaves. In America you're not going to hear a lot about the shady stuff the US government did to its own citizens in the 1950s and 1960s. Project MKUltra was the code name of a secret CIA program that involved all sorts of crazy things that most Americans have heard of but don't really know a lot of details about. And some of the stuff done under this program is so unbelievably weird that MKUltra is a punchline in some circles. And that's just the one that's common knowledge. There were programs set up where the government would inject uranium into people without telling them in order to see the effects. Sometimes directly into their sexual organs. You need to dig deep into some weird rabbit holes to find information about stuff like this. And a lot of time you need to sift through all sorts of conspiracy theory BS in order to find the actual story. And even then you can't be 100% certain that what you uncovered is real or fake. But even so, it's pretty well established that in the 1960s in particular the US government was up to its elbows in some pretty bad stuff involving its own citizens. And you'll never hear anything about it even in college-level courses unless you have some really groovy instructors. I think this is something that generally isn't taught, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I learned about it in middle school. Then a professor mentioned it in college and no one else in my class heard of it. Then I stumbled upon an article to use as a teacher. None of my coworkers had ever heard of it. It's had a huge impact on safety regulations. Was the biggest workplace tragedy in American history until September 11 and exposed serious shortcomings in corporate management, workplace safety standards, and employees' rights. We learned a lot from that fire, but it's sad that it had to get to that point before we would learn those lessons. That Franklin Roosevelt supported Mussolini and said something along the lines of how he wished he could emulate him back home. Obviously, we can ignore the rest of the effort that the US put into helping the Nazis. Both Roosevelt and Stalin wanted to execute every single captured German soldier. Winston Churchill nipped that in the bud and said something like, "No. I will never execute somebody for fighting for their country." The US was responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of rapes throughout Europe during World War II. The only people ever charged were black people. The US tried to enforce racial segregation within the UK and Australia during World War II, even going as far as ensuring that they did not purchase from any shop that sold anything to black people. This resulted in countless fights between British and American soldiers. One American died in Australia as a result of these fights. The black Americans stayed hanging around with the British and Australian soldiers, which had minimal racism. History, at least when I was taught, has a Western bias. We tend to teach when we discovered certain things or developed certain theories, when we weren't necessarily the first. That's understandable, because that's how we learn those things. However, in a lot of cases there were Arabic, Indian, or Asian scholars who had very similar theories or even discovered things before we did. It gives us Westerns a kind of bias where we think we invented science and astronomy and maths, when that's not really the case at all. It was happening all over the world. Socialism and cultural Marxism were not only failures but had an absolutely evil history over the 20th century. Not just that, but the Democrat Party has an absolutely evil history. Most American atrocities were committed by Democrats or Democratic politicians. Trail of Tears was Andrew Jackson. Slavery was pushed by the Democrat Party. Andrew Johnson, Democrat who ran with Lincoln, blocked a lot of Republican attempts to bring equal rights to blacks who were freed. The Jim Crow laws were wholly supported by Democrats. The whole American world police idea was started by Woodrow Wilson. He was also very racist, segregated the U.S. military. The KKK had the Democrats as an ally until the 1930s-40s. Gun control was also originally implemented to keep blacks from owning firearms in Jim Crow states, and Japanese internment was done by FDR. Native Americans weren't granted citizenship until the 1920s. Aboriginals, the native owners of Australia, were not even considered human until 1967. It's how sad most schools don't teach much of the genocide of Native Americans. Most you'll get is the Trail of Tears and Wounded Knee, only cause of Jackson and Custer. The Kuwaitis are going through something similar as far as I've read. A while back they have started registering citizens, only to find out I don't know how long later that some of the ancestors did not register. Now their grandchildren are basically second class and do not possess a nationality or equal rights. In the Philippine-American War, more correctly, the Moro conflict, in one area many villagers fled to a volcanic crater. While there were certainly guerrillas in there, it is clear that they were mostly full of civilians that fled there for refuge, including children. To get ahead of the contrarian comments, the guerrillas in there were definitely not that moral, stole from other villages, history of violence, maybe pro-slavery, but it's up to you to determine where your comfort zone of justification is for what follows. The American governor of the province said that the inhabitants had no intention of fighting from there. They declined to leave or disarm. Important to note, their arms were short swords and spears. As a historical note, the Muslim population of the Philippines was largely not colonized during the Spanish period. So imagine resisting colonial powers for hundreds of years. You've, supposedly, just moved your family to get away from violence, and suddenly the new colonizer on the block shows up and tells you to move. They were pretty much massacred by any definition with modern artillery, grenades, bullets, bayonets, etc. Out of almost 1,000 people, there were 6 survivors. About 20 Americans died. And before we get into a whole discussion over applying our morality over people of the past, let me add that this was a PR nightmare back in the US. Imagine how bad you have to be to outrage the early 1,900 US white public over the deaths of Filipino Muslims on the other side of the world. Sadly, very little of that outrage made its way to public school history. You may get lucky if you're smart enough to get into advanced high school history or have a really motivated teacher, but I had both of those and didn't learn about this, and other massacres, until much later by accident. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more controversial videos. Click the right box for the facts playlist. Let us know in the comments what you think about these facts. Do you think they are true? Can you debunk some of them?